Okay, I just had you take a look at an infographic that explained that there were conservative food and that there's liberal food. And probably looking at it and go, what the heck is going on here? So the next three videos really talk about how taste and smell relate to politics and why they think that there's a connection. Normally, I probably would have done this as one longer video, but I want to keep the videos themselves short. So we're going to have three videos that could be kind of considered one long video. Okay, so we're going to start with fruit flies. This was research done at UC Riverside, right down the road. So most fruit flies like sugar water, and if you have, and that's why they're called fruit flies because they like the sugar in fruit. And so if you set out a bowl of sugar water in an area where there are a lot of fruit flies, it will attract every fruit fly in the area, except that a few fruit flies actually prefer beer. And so UC Riverside researchers gave fruit flies a choice of either sugar water or beer. And then they selectively bred the flies. Which So they bred the flies that like sugar together and the flies that like beer together. And once they had several generations later, so you had somebody who had a strong genetic predisposition to beer and a different fly that had a strong predisposition to sugar water, they then did a genomic sequence trying to figure out what was the thing that triggered the fruit flies to like beer over sugar water or the other way around. What they found was that a minority of the flies preferred beer over sugar water, and the ones that did lacked the GR64E gene. And so from here, biologists concluded that at least insofar as fruit flies, their food preferences are related to their genetic makeup, and in particular, whether or not they have the GR64E gene in their own genome. Okay, a separate but related experiment. Arthur Fox, who was a chemist working for DuPont, accidentally discovered that people who are extremely sensitive to PTC do not like vegetables. Um, um, Conservatives are significantly more likely than liberals to be able to taste PTC. Therefore, we can test for PTC and discover within reason has some indication whether someone's liberal or conservative based on whether they had this particular characteristic. So there was a really famous kind of humorous incident that happened when George Bush Sr. was president. He put out a directive that he not be served broccoli going forward, and that none of the White House state dinners feature the broccoli vegetable. He said, I've eaten broccoli all my life. Now I'm president and I don't have to eat broccoli anymore. Of course, the Broccoli Growers Association had a fit over this. But we do know that George Bush Sr. had a fairly strong aversion to broccoli, and we can, kind of infer from that it was that he was fairly sensitive to PTC. There is a caveat that's necessary to point out here, and that is that food is shaped by family and by biology. So you probably have a family dish every single Thanksgiving. My family has a type of dinner roll called a butterhorn. And it's just not Thanksgiving without a butterhorn. So the first Thanksgiving I spent away from home. I'd just gotten out of college and I'm living in Washington, D.C., away from my family. I can't get back to California. My mom actually sent me a box of butterhorns so that I could, match it with my turkey dinner, so I wouldn't be without butterhorns on Thanksgiving. And so those kind of things, get built in. And even if you weren't necessarily predisposed to like butterhorns, I actually don't like them all that much. I eat them every Thanksgiving because it's a family thing. But we also know that food preferences are shaped by biology. So when we talk about like nature versus nurture, we have to understand that both of these things come into play. Okay, here's another experiment that's kind of interesting. So, researchers named Hatemi found that there were four chromosomal regions that seem to correlate with ideology. These regions overlap with the things that help us develop our sense of smell. So then, researchers took that information and said, okay, what has a really strong smell that we think might be correlated with ideology. And we tend to think that people who are very sensitive to testosterone and are more likely to be conservative. Um, Testosterone itself doesn't emit a smell, but I'm going to screw this word up. And androstenone does emit a smell, and these two hormones are in usually seen in correlation. So if you've got high testosterone, you're also likely to have high androsterone. So we can test for androsterone and find out whether or not you have high testosterone. And so if somebody can smell the androsterone, that means that we think that they sense that the person has a high testosterone level. Um, there is a connection between the ability to smell androstenone to the OR7D4 gene. And we also know that people who are more likely to smell androstenone are more comfortable with social hierarchies. People comfortable with social hierarchies are more likely to be conservative. And so then they wanted to do a test to see if the ability to smell this hormone was related to conservative politics. In general, smell preferences are highly correlated with your political beliefs, which just makes it a really interesting thing. So if you've got this OR74 gene, you really are way more likely to be conservative. Okay, one more kind of study like this. The candidate gene that they were studying, that the Settle researchers, the researchers led by a guy named Settle, their candidate gene was DRD4. And previous research had shown that liberals were more open to new experiences. That's the political psychology stuff that we did in the last in an earlier section. The study also showed that people who had the long version of DRD4 had many more friends in childhood than people who had the short version. So your social butterfly in second grade probably had the long version of DRD4, and the child who holed up in the library and didn't want to be outside probably had the short version. The longer version of DRD4 is associated with social belonging, empathy, and trust. And of course, this would make you be more likely to have lots of friends. People who have a lot of friends tend to be exposed to a greater variety of viewpoints. Exposure to a greater variety of viewpoints is correlated with liberalism. And so the Settle study went out and looked at whether or not you could take a shortcut between all of these steps. Liberals are open to new experiences. People who are open to new experiences have a lot of friends. People who have a lot of friends are exposed to a greater variety of viewpoints. Exposure to a greater variety of viewpoints is correlated with liberalism. They wanted to see if they could skip right to the if you have the long version of DRD4, you're way more likely to be liberal. And it's really important to understand that the environment itself had a role in shaping the gene. So kids who are more social, they come from families that are encourage them to be very social, are more likely to have the long version of the gene rather than the short version. This became lauded in the press as scientists have found the liberal gene, but that's not the real story because there were people who had the long version of DRD4 who were not liberal, but it does show us that you have a predisposition to be liberal.